Thanks, Steve, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Investment Supervision and Policy Division presentation. As Steve said, I'm joined on the stage by Louise, who I'm pleased to say, despite another hectic travel schedule this year, is actually on Ireland today and will be presenting to you later. Now, you might have noticed that Mark LePage is conspicuous by his absence, and following a bit of a trend, if you were at the fiduciary presentation earlier this morning, Mark is currently on paternity leave and will be joining us in virtual form shortly. Now, in terms of the virtual form, I understand this morning's presentations have gone very well, so we'll wait and see what the next 15 minutes gives you. But our presentations, all the actors in ISPD have moved to other divisions, and with Mark on paternity leave, we're doing a bit more face-to-camera pieces rather than anything to the scale you've seen earlier this morning. So I just wanted to set your expectations early. We do hope, however, that the next 15 minutes you'll find informative, and as I stand here now, I cannot fathom why, but I actually requested an extra 10 minutes for this year's presentation, but at least that means there'll be plenty of time for the questions and answers at the end. Now, you may have heard from William yesterday that the theme for this year's industry presentation is the interaction of business culture with regulation in the present decade. Applying that theme to our presentation, we wish to spend some time drawing out three main areas that have been occupying our time over the past year. Under conflicts of interest, I will share with you extracts from the discussions we have had with licensees and boards of funds over conflicts of interest, including how to recognise, declare and manage them and ensure compliance with the regulations. Under culture and financial statements, Mark will speak on the supervisory issues leading us to introduce the late accounts and modified audit opinion policy. And then finally, Louise will describe the approaches from her international colleagues towards culture and how we must have an eye to these influences on our own methods. We will wrap everything up by covering a number of key messages, a bit of a 5-minute whistle-stop tour through some of the key takeaways that we'd like you to have from today. And if you don't listen to anything else during this next 50 minutes, I would urge you to listen to those 5. And very finally, to end on a positive note, Mark will take us through the manager-led product and we will launch the private investment fund. So to kick off, conflicts of interest. It's a very common phrase in many spheres, but particularly in financial services. Paragraphs, if not pages, in prospectuses, scheme particulars and the like are dedicated to the disclosures and handling of conflicts of interest. The Commission's own website returns 60 references from a search on this matter. And in the Commission's rules, there is conversations over conflicts of interest across the whole sector of the rules in the investment sector. And also, the Code on Corporate Governance includes a section on conflicts under the section entitled Business Conduct and Ethics. Probably the most significant reference is in the Licensees' Conduct of Business Rules 2014, where an entire Principle 3, exists on conflicts of interest. I won't read it out to you, but would highlight the references throughout to customers and the fair treatment of customers. In addition, while most of us accept that conflicts of interest exist and need to be managed, I do think the first line of Principle 3 is worth focusing on. A licensee should either avoid any conflict, whilst admirable, and indeed the ideal, avoidance we know is not always possible. I'm confident that to the vast majority of you, the concept of conflicts of interest will not be anything new, and indeed is not rocket science. That being the case, the first step of identifying a conflict, and this has slightly lost its impact, now you've already seen it, but never mind, should be straightforward, but sometimes it is not as easy as one might think. I said I would share with you extracts from discussions we've had over the past year. And please, as you've heard from my colleagues in other divisions yesterday and indeed earlier today, the examples of poorer behaviour are thankfully few in number. However, their presence is concerning and therefore worth sharing. Rather surprisingly, we have had to point out to some members of boards that they do have conflicts in the first place. I've also been surprised when we've asked for a copy of them by the standard of the conflicts of interest policies in place, often being too generic and missing the mark. A policy should be a valuable tool in helping one identify conflicts of interest, but also assist with steps 2 and 3 of declaring and managing conflicts that I'll move to shortly. The requirement for a policy on conflicts of interest is at Rule 11 of the Conduct of Business Rules. And whilst not wishing to repeat all of that section of the rules here to you today, it is suffice to say that the policy must identify the circumstances which constitute or may give rise to a conflict of interest entailing a material risk of damage to the interests of one or more clients. The Code of Corporate Governance has the requirements for the boards of collective investment schemes to establish, implement and maintain an effective conflicts of interest policy, which sets out the standards of expected behaviour, including, amongst other matters, the treatment of any non-compliance with the policy. It is worth remembering that fact that the Code of Corporate Governance applies to funds as well as licensees, and we do routinely review conflicts of interest policies as part of our engagement tasks under PRISM and risk-based supervision. The second step in handling conflicts of interest is declaring any conflicts. At the start of any board meeting, conflicts of interest should be discussed, with periodic reminders being presented. But who monitors those conflicts? Traditionally, the role of a company secretary. Not a requirement of Guernsey company law, admittedly, but arguably perhaps a good practice to have one. At the very least, if one is prone to forgetting one's own conflicts, it might be an idea to have someone on the board or in attendance at the meeting to remind you. I have seen over the past year the very positive actions by some NEDs and other parties in reminding board members of their conflicts of interest, to the point of making what I would imagine the other directors consider to be a complete nuisance of themselves, and requiring the conflicted directors to physically remove themselves from meetings. And of course, most importantly of all, conflicts should be declared to your clients through the appropriate means. Assuming the conflict has been identified and declared, the third step is to manage the conflict of interest. If the licensee's policy on conflicts of interest is sufficiently robust, managing the conflict should not be a problem. However, where we have seen problems arise is where, for example, the licensee is an investment advisor or manager to a fund where that fund, for an array of different reasons, is experiencing difficulties. On a day-to-day basis, the conflicts are managed well. But when that norm shifts into more difficult territory, causing perhaps decisions to be needed to be taken at a greater speed than usual, the controls around conflicts may slip. Of course, we all know that it is at these very times that the controls need to be robust. It's also at these times that other controls come into force, for example, arm's length transactions. Again, in name, it sounds straightforward. The requirement to undertake transactions at arm's length is in the rules for each type of Guernsey fund, and requires that arrangements between the relevant person and the collective investment scheme are at least as favourable to the scheme as would be any comparable arrangement effected on normal commercial terms, negotiated at arm's length between the relevant person and an independent party. While supposedly well understood as a concept, in times of stress, a board's judgments on how to conduct themselves may become diluted, and transactions may be considered that would not otherwise have been undertaken. For example, the sales of assets to a related party. Clearly, however well-intended these transactions may be, they cannot be allowed to take place without being demonstrably at arm's length. We have seen examples of funds in managed wind-down where such transactions have been proposed to be undertaken not demonstrably at arm's length. I'd like to pause here for a moment from conflicts of interest and mention another area of concern during a managed wind-down. In managed wind-down situation, directors must be aware of considerable risks. That is, whilst a managed wind-down may well seem to be the most cost-effective approach, those directors must be certain that the company has not become insolvent, placing their own position in jeopardy. This is a situation we have started to see, as unfortunately some funds do find themselves in difficulty. So anyway, back to conflicts. The conflicts of interest I have described thus far have been the expected ones involving board members. However, there are a number of others that we see crop up from time to time. Conflicts of roles or wearing too many hats. For example, can a client relationship manager really be an effective MLRO or compliance officer? And I had already written that before I saw my colleague's presentation this morning from Financial Crime. If you missed that, by the way, it is a bit of a blockbuster and it's very worth a watch when it's available on our website. Or should the highest fee earner really be on the Remuneration Committee. And as well as at the individual level, there are the different overlapping interests and relationships of the entities involved in providing financial services to clients. I saw an excellent example recently of the way conflicts that arise in these situations should be managed. The compliance officer to an administrator met with us on an issue involving one of their clients. That same compliance officer had been instructed by their client, an investment manager, to also deliver a letter to the Commission on their behalf. As the meeting was focused on the role of the administrator, that compliance officer did not even bring the letter with them to the meeting. Instead, they completed the meeting, at the end advised us of the existence of the letter, and upon return to their office, arranged for the letter to be delivered to us separately. Some of you might feel that was overkill, but all it took was a little forethought, and it was exactly the right thing to do. It ensured that during the conversations, we knew who we were talking to and about what. Of course, many of you do have multiple roles, and we're not necessarily saying that you shouldn't. This is just a reminder to know what hat you have on when, and not to forget the interests of the ultimate client, the investor. As I have said, none of this is rocket science or new to you. Conflicts should be identified, declared, and managed, or see it, state it, and manage it. We'll now run the VT to listen to Mark talking about culture and financial statements and our new policy.
One of the supervisory matters for us over the last 12 months or so has been the issue of late accounts and indeed accounts with modified audit opinions. This has been something that many of you who are older will remember was an issue back in the credit crunch of 2008-2009. You will also no doubt remember how we started trying to take more fees out of that through a penalty regime. And that penalty regime worked until the last 12 months, where the incidence of late accounts and indeed of qualified audit accounts has gone up. And this has led to us to introduce a policy of which some of you are already aware, which is that if we receive a set of accounts which has a qualified audit opinion, or if at the time of deadline the accounts are late, then we will give you notice that we will be placing conditions on the fund. And these conditions will vary depending on the circumstances of the fund, but fundamentally will stop monies being either placed into the fund or monies taken out. Now, some of you have already asked about what that means in practice, and does that include the taking of management fees and administrative fees and, if applicable, custodian fees? Well, the answer to that is that one needs to be very, very careful. Check the contractual provisions. But certainly, for example, if the accounts are containing an audit opinion that is a disclaimer, then I would suggest that that is something that you should think very, very carefully indeed. So when will those conditions be lifted? Well, the answer to that is when the matter is resolved, and clearly that will happen through careful discussion with us. Some circumstances will be much easier than others. So, for example, if and when the late accounts are received, and there are no concerns from those, then the conditions will be lifted. If there are concerns, for example, a material write-down of an investment, well then clearly there is a discussion for us to have. And there'll be similar discussions around how audit opinions get resolved, and indeed we might well be asking for you to come in with your auditors to discuss how assurance has been reached after the events that have caused us concern. So in the meantime, what advice can I give you? Well, the simplest piece of advice I can say is that if you are getting near to your deadline date and you know there is going to be an issue of the type that I've just discussed, please do come and speak with us. Certainly from a supervisory perspective, it is much easier if we can start to discuss the issues with you at an earlier date rather than have to start pressing panic buttons.
Thank you, Mark. Well, you've heard from Mark's clip, him speaking about our new policy regarding late fund accounts and qualified accounts introduced recently as a response to an increasing trend of late fund accounts and qualified opinions. I'm now going to take the opportunity before I launch into my whistle-top tour of the global trends in culture to expand upon that policy and what it means in practice. Under this policy, when accounts are not submitted by their submission date, a letter will be sent to the designated manager of the fund, giving notice of the Commission's intention to impose conditions on the fund's authorisation or registration. The notice will usually be 28 days, which should allow sufficient time, for example, administrative errors to be cleared up. We will be seeking voluntary agreement to the conditions to the relevant parties, but will impose the conditions subject to the relevant appeal process, but depending on the circumstances. The conditions on the fund's authorisation or registration, depending on whether the fund is open-ended or closed-ended, are likely to be no further subscriptions, capital calls, redemptions, and no promotion of the fund. Since the introduction of this policy, the division has imposed conditions on 4 funds due to the accounts not being submitted within the relevant deadline. Our condition notice letters, however, have been effective in promoting the submission of late accounts prior to the expiration of the notice period. And consequently, the actual number of condition letters issued cannot be equated to the number of notice letters issued. Also, a polite reminder, penalty fees will continue to accrue until the accounts are submitted. Mark also mentioned the treatment of funds that submit accounts with audit opinions. So which are the opinions which really concern us? Well, firstly, a qualified opinion, where the auditor concludes there are misstatements that are material to the financial statements, that the auditor is unable to obtain sufficient, appropriate audit evidence, and concludes that the possible effects on the financial statements could be material. Secondly, a disclaimer of opinion, where the auditor is unable to obtain sufficient, appropriate audit evidence and that the possible effects are material and pervasive, or multiple uncertainties that could combine in a way which would result in the auditors not expressing an opinion. And thirdly, an adverse opinion, where the audit evidence has been attained, but the auditors do not believe that it fairly presents the financial position of the fund, or it is not in conformity of the relevant accounting standards, or the required information was either not disclosed, or was inadequately disclosed, or was inaccurate. When the division receives the accounts with such opinions or disclaimers, we will impose conditions immediately, depending on the circumstances. However, we are conscious that on some occasions, a qualified opinion may arise from a technical disclosure made, for example, accounting standards enforce a particular method of presentation that does not reflect the economic reality of the fund. As Mark suggested in the video clip, an early discussion with the division if the fund accounts are likely to be qualified or a disclaimer is likely is recommended. Also, the fund's auditors may wish to consider a discussion with the division. So, since the introduction of that policy, the division has imposed conditions on 4 funds. So, now to culture and the global perspective. If you search the word culture on any reputed international securities regulator's website, you're bound to get a number of hits. Since the global crisis of 2007, 2008, regulators from around the globe have placed increasing emphasis on culture when supervising firms. Why? Well, culture is seen to be the cause of decision-making, conduct, and behaviour at firms. it has long been recognised that new regulations in isolation is never going to work without the appropriate culture. Christine Lagarde of the IMF was quoted as stating that simply adding regulations is not the answer. So then, what have regulators around the globe been doing to change and instill the appropriate culture in firms? Given that it's recognised that changing culture is difficult, as it comes from past CEOs, boards, systems, and controls, and it can take time. ESMA, the European authority responsible for safeguarding the stability of the European Union's financial system, explains its own culture of being mandated to take an active role in building a common supervisory culture among national competent authorities to promote sound, efficient, and consistent supervision throughout the European Union. And ESMA has not been shy in instilling a raft of regulations, new or revised, with an underlying theme being the drive to change or instill a particular culture. If we take MiFID II, for example, well, let's be honest, you didn't think I'd be able to give a speech at the industry seminar without mentioning MiFID II. One of the objectives of the revisions to the original directive is to increase the level of investor protection by obliging firms to take responsibility for products throughout the life cycle and preventing firms' own interests and commercial or funding needs from prejudicing the client's interests. Steve Major, ESMA's chairman, said, "The financial crisis has revealed many instances where the rules on selling investment services to retail clients failed to ensure that firms acted in their clients' best interests." So moving from the EU to Asia, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, MAS, had been particularly active in instilling a fair culture. MAS has used its recent FAIR, the Financial Advisory Industry Review, to assess board and senior management's efforts in promoting a culture of fair dealing within their organisation. A representative from MAS, in a speech to the Association of Financial Advisors in Singapore as recently as July 2015, spoke about setting the right tone, not just at the top of an organisation, but also the middle. MAS has recognised that even the most intrusive supervisor can only go so far in the promotion of a culture of ethics. Industry itself must take collective responsibility, with financial institutions ultimately bearing the responsibility for getting the culture right. It is recognised that shaping culture demands a substantial effort on the part of the financial institutions. And MAS has challenged its firms to consider not only is it legal, but is it right? Like many regulators in the last decade, MAS has provided a safe environment through a whistleblowing programme for individuals to challenge, question, and report unethical behaviour to ensure business culture is appropriately calibrated. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, to give it its full title, brought about the most significant change to the financial regulation in the US with a view to instill the right culture. It now appears that that act may be under threat, and its ongoing uncertainty remains. But that act gives the SEC further enforcement powers, which includes a whistleblower bounty programme, whereby the SEC rewards individuals who provide information that leads to an SEC enforcement action in which more than $1 million in sanctions is ordered. The aim is to foster a culture where individuals share their concerns with the SEC and speak up at an early stage to prevent a culture of wrongdoing becoming entrenched. The Chief of Staff at the SEC in a recent speech spoke of a culture of always doing the right thing, not tolerating bad practices or bad actors is essential. Since the financial crisis, the FCA, nearer to home, has been focusing on getting culture and conduct right by paying close attention to the cultures of firms and what boards and management are doing to shape the culture, of which governance is a key factor. Culture is a priority for the FCA, one of 7 business plan priorities for 2016-17. So culture and governance is one of the priorities for the FCA's policy work, thematic projects, and work undertaken in day-to-day authorisation and supervision. So how do you drive cultural change? The FCA's response to the Parliamentary Commission for Banking Standards was the introduction of their senior manager and certification regime, which aims to improve professional standards and culture within the UK banking industry. A rules-based regime has been adopted to ensure that firms and regulators are clear about who is responsible and for what. The aim is for individual accountability to focus minds, drive up standards, and make firms easier to run and to supervise. The regime has also introduced a duty of responsibility, which means senior managers are requested to take the steps that it is reasonable for a person in that position to take to prevent a regulatory breach from occurring. So ultimately, that regime is about instilling the right culture. The FCA are looking to extend that regime to all authorised firms and will consult next year. Their Director of Enforcement and Market Oversight, in a speech November last year, warned that culture is in danger of becoming a buzzword, an integrated ideal of good governance, regulatory compliance, and fair process. Intangible, theoretical, in danger of becoming merely regulatory and yet another catchphrase. It cannot be bought and sold. I would be as bold to disagree with his comments. You've heard from Emma and Mark that from a Guernsey perspective, far from being intangible and theoretical, culture is multifaceted and tangible in the management of conflicts, identifiable through the financial statements. I'm now going to hand over to Emma to deal with key messages.
Thanks, Louise. And you can probably see why Louise and I chose to sit in seats close to the podium rather than at the table during the transitions here. Right, as I said earlier, we wanted to just highlight some of the key messages for the remainder of this year and into 2017. As you will see, at the core of what we do, our primary objective remains the same, and indeed that's to execute high-quality, risk-based, prudential, financial crime and conduct regulation via a series of full risk assessments and engagement visits and a thematic. Therefore, you can pretty much expect more of the same. Now, taking some of the supporting tasks that you can see around the main hexagon there, we will cover fund strategy a little later when we talk about the manager-led product and the private investment fund, but clearly it's very much of importance to us. Moving round to online submissions, we have very nearly reached the point where all notifications from licensees and funds are now online. The last of the main stable of forms to go live is the licensee's annual compliance return, and thank you to those licensees who have been helping us to pilot this form very recently. The licensee's conduct of business rules will change as a result of the introduction of that form online, and Schedule 1 in particular will be amended from including the paper copy of the compliance return to referring to the online compliance return. And this will be issued for a very short consultation in December. Now, online submissions also cover PQs, and in response to a recent question in a meeting, I thought it would be worth reiterating to you that directors are required to record all their directorships in the online PQ submission. So, the IOSCO EMMOU, or Enhanced Multilateral Memorandum of Understanding to give it its full name. Now, this will be a significant piece of policy work for us, and it will be important in order to ensure that Guernsey maintains its position as a credible and cooperative financial services jurisdiction. Alongside the IOSCO EMMOU, we'll continue to run our main other international policy matters, being AFMD and MiFID II. We will also continue to work with our colleagues in the Authorisations Unit to ensure that the authorisations process is a robust gatekeeper, and will continue to work on more domestically driven policy like the Code of Market Conduct, and consultation will be issued on this very shortly. Now, clearly this list is not exhaustive, but it does give you a flavour of the matters which will occupy us. However, in addition, we'll continue to meet with industry members, individually and in their interest groups, on a wide range of matters, and we value that open dialogue with you. As you may be aware, a key part of PRISM is an annual thematic review per sector. So far in investment, we have undertaken 2 thematics. The first covered custody, where there is a derogation in place to allow for the use of a prime broker rather than a local custodian. And the findings of that thematic were published on our website earlier this year. More recently, as many of you will know, we have undertaken a joint thematic with the Financial Crime Division. Thank you to those licensees who have participated, and we are in the course of reviewing your responses, and will be accompanying our colleagues in the Financial Crime Division on a number of on-site visits identified from the review of the data. Now, all of you may wish to take note of the smaller circles, which provide the potential themes for next year. The thematics might not always follow the same format. As you've seen, we have already done one jointly with another division. But they always improve our understanding of risks in a certain area and facilitate identification and understanding of emerging risks. This next slide shows that it will be another busy year with a number of projects as already described to you, but with that core of risk-based supervision running through our work. So the key message we'd like you to take away from today is we need to work together, we are reliant on a strong finance sector, and consider that the jurisdiction benefits from a robust and credible regulator. Now, you should by now, if you weren't already aware, know who myself, Mark and Louise are. However, we thought it would also be useful to share with you the rest of the investment team and the divisional structure. They are slightly more camera shy than some of my colleagues in other divisions, so they're just here in name only. But I would like to take this opportunity to thank each member of the team for their incredible support and commitment through what has been another busy and challenging year. So now to return to Mark LePage, the sequel. Before we formally launch the PIF, Mark will start out by commenting on the manager-led product.
The reason I'm sitting here today, rather than standing up on the podium, and you are therefore watching a video of me and therefore avoiding all of my usual bad jokes, is because in all probability I will be sitting in a delivery room as my wife gives birth to our second child. So at the moment I'm struggling to work out where I'm out of my comfort zone more. But in some ways it is a very interesting parable, because at a time of new beginnings for me personally, this year has also been a time for seeking to regenerate and initiate new ideas within the investment fund sector. Most of you will of course be familiar with the manager-led product, where in one of the own goals of my own personal life, I didn't spot that the title actually was my initials. But the point of the manager-led product was to recognise that many firms are seeking to have greater substance in the island, and we were wanting to ensure a proportionate and pragmatic regulatory regime around that would also be cost efficient. So we are hopeful that this product will be well used as time goes on. When I spoke to members of GIFA at the time, I said that the manager-led product was currently in phase 1, that being a product which could be used to market into the EU under the national private placement regime. I also promised GIFA, in response to some representations given me, that we would be doing a phase 2, looking at preparing a set of rules that would make the manager-led product fit for purpose to be marketed in most jurisdictions in the world. And this will be a phase which we will be engaging on very shortly. Therefore, on my return to the office, I would be very pleased to meet with anyone who has a clear set of ideas or even some early formed thoughts about what exactly those rules should look like. Our initial thoughts are that it will certainly not be as stringent as a full AFMD equivalent regime, but clearly there are attractions for investors, particularly in the sophisticated space, if products have strong liquidity and indeed cash management arrangements. So therefore, it is highly likely that phase 2 will include some rules around that. But in the meantime, I look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And so, to the launch of the Private Investment Fund. I am really pleased to announce the launch of this product, and if you allow me, we'll just quickly run through a few of the key features which we feel will make it as flexible as possible while still retaining the essence of what it is, a private investment fund. So it can have up to 50 natural or legal persons, and warranties will allow us to turn around the applications in one business day. There'll be no rules applied to the manager and no requirement for scheme particulars. And as you can see from there, they can either be open or closed-ended. I'd like to thank everyone who has contributed to the development of the product or participated in the recently closed consultation. I'm pleased to say that through the consultation period, there's already been some interest in the use of the fund, and we can see that the attractions could be across all sectors, not just the fund sector, perhaps family offices or the clients of fiduciary industry. Our news release with the relevant application form and the rules should be on the website by the end of today. The Private Investment Fund will help complete the suite of Guernsey funds, which we feel is and will continue to be simple, flexible and comprehensive. And we look forward to future participation with you on the development of this product and others. Well, you'll be pleased to hear that all I need to do now is say thank you for your attendance and your attention today, but we do now have a little time remaining for any questions. But first, Louise and I will just cross across the stage to the table to take them there. Thank you.